Hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. We still have a few people trickling in, but because we've got a lot of topics to discuss, I wanted to start more or less on time today. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Helen Willits. I'm Advocacy Director at Seas at Risk, and I'm moderating today's webinar on red lines in the abyss. We've had quite a good response to today's webinar, so we're expecting a few more people to join as we go along. Seas at Risk is a European umbrella organization of marine NGOs. We have 39 members now in 19 European countries, and deep sea mining is one of the many topics that we work on. But my colleague will tell you more about that shortly. And deep sea mining campaign is obviously more specialized in deep sea mining as their topic. They work very closely with local communities, with the grassroots level, with scientists to protect marine life in the Pacific, but also globally. And we've worked together over the years and very recently on a new paper that we'll tell you more about very soon. Today's webinar is being recorded. Thank you. We're being recorded today. We will publish the recording on our website after the webinar, so you can check it out there. And it will also be on our social media. We ask you please to rename yourself if you can, to include your organization, your full name and your organization, so we can see who is attending today. And also there isn't a chat function for today's webinar, but there is at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A option. After the presentations, we'll come to the Q&A part. So if you have anything you want to ask any of today's participants, please drop your message in there, and we will cover as many as we can. Also, if you know who you would like to ask your question to, it's helpful to pop that in the question as well, so we can I can target it to the right person. Next slide, please. Today's agenda is, well, we're going to launch directly into the presentations. This is the running order you can see on your screen now. First, it will be my colleague at Seas at Risk, Simon Holmstrom. He is our Senior Deep Sea Mining Policy Officer. He will be doing a joint presentation with Andy Whitmore, who many of you may know as Whit. So if you hear us talking about Whit, we mean Andy. He's the Finance Advocacy Officer at Deep Sea Mining Campaign, and we work, we've had a very good working relationship over the years that continues. We're also joined by Emine Essiel. She is Head of Climate and Environment for Storebrand Asset Management, and also Daniel Saylor, Head of Sustainable Investment Office at Metzler Asset Management. And they are really going to be able to help us have a deep dive into the financial side of things. So we'll be bringing more, you know, the science and kind of our advocacy bit, but you're going to hear from the financial experts as well. And that will be followed by a Q&A. So without any further ado, I will hand over to my colleague Simon, who will start the presentations. Thank you.
And thank you so much for that, Helen. It's a pleasure to talk about this topic, and thank you all for joining. So a little bit of background before we go into the report, and also some other state of play updates on the financial side on deep sea mining. As you are very much well aware, the race for critical raw materials is really heating up. Attention is moving towards more remote and extreme environments, and the deep sea is really one of them. Deep sea mining is an industry that is being promoted quite heavily by a relatively small group of actors. They say that they are ready to move from today's exploration towards commercial exploitation. At the same time, we know that the deep sea is far from a barren landscape. The deep sea is a very much complex biome, rich in biodiversity, and these ecosystems are amongst the least explored and understood on the planet. Deep sea mining risks therefore destroying species not yet known to science and interfering with ecosystem services that we do not yet know exactly how they work. And it is for this reason that growing number of groups of scientists, environmental organizations, ocean users, different types of businesses, and also more recently financiers, and the topic of today's discussion, have come out and called for a moratorium or a precautionary pause on the industry. What makes this industry, let's say, interesting, or at least interesting for me, is that much of the interest and the exploration activities are in areas beyond national jurisdiction. These are governed collectively through the International Seabed Authority, the ISA. This is a system designed to manage resources for the humankind as a whole, according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And negotiations, as you also might know, on a so-called mining code in the ISA, they are ongoing, and there are still significant gaps unresolved in the negotiations. After the last round here in March, it stands quite clear that no such mining code would be adopted any soon. Despite this, pressure to move forward is absolutely increasing. Most noteworthy is the US, which last year started advancing deep sea mining within international waters, and also within domestic legislation. So these kind of dual strands of deep sea mining push, let's say. And what has been perhaps more contentious is, of course, the pursuit to advance deep sea mining licenses in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, more specifically the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the Pacific, which is directly bypassing the mandate of the ISA. And therefore, most legal experts and countries agree that this is in violation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and most notably the principle of the common heritage of humankind, and even go as far as saying that this is in customary international law, and that it binds the US as a signatory to UNCLOS as a minimum not to work against this very principle. So this kind of background of the state of play where we come into the topic, and I think it's also quite interesting to see that so far the discussion has been mostly environmental, regulatory uncertainty, geopolitics with the US move. However, far less attention has been given to whether deep sea mining at all makes financial sense. In fact, it is the financial sector which holds the ultimate power to enable or halt deep sea mining entirely. So this is why we, Seas at Risk, in collaboration with the Deep Sea Mining Campaign, commissioned a report to map financial institutions that have expressed various levels of concern on deep sea mining. And we started this work by really narrowing down the kind of first set of numbers. 132 is the first number of financial institutions with a high likelihood, according to us, a high likelihood of having exhibited such concerns. Some of these come from various statements that have been made, joint statements, but also organizations, financial institutions that were known to us and others that we're working with, for instance, Planet Tracker and WWF. And out of these, we found that 82 financial institutions have taken a public stance on the very issue. Importantly, 37 have gone further and adopted explicit exclusion policies. And these policies restrict or prohibit financing for deep sea mining in different ways. And we've added excerpts of these policies in the annex of the report, which you might find in the chat if you haven't read it already. And you can see exactly how they've been writing these policies. And if we then add even two extra. We actually wanted to add two extra banks to the 37 because they also had specific due diligence requirements on deep sea mining. So the number is also 39, and this is the number that we use for this map. As you can see, the financial institutions with policies on deep sea mining are mostly from Europe. Of course, we could do a map with all the 82, and then we could also see more continents. And so we've got some questions as to why that is. One might argue that this is because European finance has been earlier than others to systematically integrate ESG and biodiversity risk into credit and investment policy. Could be. More importantly, though, the EU, as well as 20 other European countries, support a moratorium or a precautionary pause on deep sea mining. And it is quite common that banks align themselves to such policies to reduce risk. Another reason could be that several important parts of the deep sea mining value chain sit in Europe, in fact, which brings European finance into a potential contact in some way or another with the sector. Banks might want to set policies to avoid involvement. We have two bank representatives to talk about that a little bit later. It's going to be interesting to hear what they say. And a little bit further, if you look into the data, we could also see here on the left-hand side the different types of financial institutions that we're looking into. It's mostly asset managers and banks that have come out with some kind of concern. These on the left are 82. And on the right-hand side, we look into those financial institutions with policies adopted that have mentioned why they have these policies adopted. Not everybody is very super clear, but here we try to extract the main reason. Of course, they mention different reasons as well. And you can see it's the environmental concern that is the majority, but quite tight after that is the uncertainty of risk. They basically say that we can't assess the risks, and that's why we just don't want to go into this, basically. And I think it's also quite interesting to see the comparison. As perhaps for me, this has been the most interesting thing to see. What some might say this is the kind of novelty of the report, who has been working with this issue for a while, and that's the assets under management. And I think the number, of course, you can have different methodological concerns that how do you come up to this? There's different ways of calculating how much assets are under the different financial institutions portfolios and so on. And indeed, it is quite hard to do comparisons with other sectors. We have chosen, though, to convey in some way or another through two other kind of usual suspects, let's say, when it comes to bank exclusions, fossil fuels and tobacco. And we wanted to convey with this that banks we've mapped are not small scale ethical banks that nobody's really heard about. Rather, on the contrary, deep sea mining is quite much and quickly becoming a mainstream financial risk issue for all kinds of banks. And what we're seeing is the early formation of a financial norm, let's say. And this matters because it shapes market expectations. Companies looking into entering perhaps this sector will face increasing difficulty securing funding. And I hope that I was on the time there. I tried to capture a lot of things at the same time. Happy to respond to any questions. And now handing over to Whit to go for the next slides.
Excellent. Okay, hopefully you can hear me, and thanks very much for that, Simone. Very good, quick, comprehensive coverage of the report. And just to say, I mean, you were mentioning banks, but obviously it's I think you used the word bank quite a lot, but it's covering all sorts of investors, including the ones we had on the slide. So I'd like to move away from the lines of the Abyss report briefly, just to update on two other recent reports that complement some of the arguments in it, but also complement the ideas around the economics of deep sea mining in general. The first is by a terrestrial mining expert called Steve Emmerman, who's pictured in the slide here. And he was commissioned by my organization, Deep Sea Mining Campaign, Greenpeace, and Mining Watch Canada to critique the metals company's pre-feasibility study, which was produced last year. Steve's final report is well over 80 pages long, so despite it including an excellent summary, it's difficult to quickly review many of the points he raises. However, I think they can best be summarized by saying that the pre-feasibility study is not as independent as it should be. And that wouldn't be allowed in some other non-US jurisdictions because it was covered by the SEC in the US. And consequently, it particularly tends to overestimate the potential benefits from the project and underestimates the cost, including this claim it's got within it that there will be zero waste. Don't have much time, so Steve's report lists 19 specific issues to be addressed, and it concludes based on those that the best thing to do is to abandon the project. It's the only kind of responsible course of action. The second report is by two academics commissioned by Greenpeace, and it's on a more macro level, and it aims to review the benefit sharing proposals developed by the International Seabed Authority. It analyzes the expectation that there's going to be financial compensation for the idea of exploiting the common heritage of humankind. And it concludes that the current projections of revenues that are available, basically those revenues for sharing are clearly insufficient to sustain or justify deep sea mining. And they use one example where they estimate the average African country would only receive less than $350,000 per year in 2018 dollars equivalent. So the links to the reports should be coming up in the chat. I think they are in the chat, which is great. And I'm happy to talk more on either report in the Q&A, although I am less knowledgeable on the second one. So next slide. Then the final slide of our presentation is basically on the recommendations that we had resulting from the research. There are recommendations for governments on the right-hand side of the slide, but given the audience, I won't concentrate too much on those. I would summarize them as endorsing a government position for a moratorium on deep sea mining, and with that, avoiding governmental, particularly financial support for the industry while prioritizing alternatives. But I think the main recommendations are the ones on the left, and those are regarding financial institutions. So the first is, if a financier hasn't already done so, to join those who have done by creating a policy excluding deep sea mining. And then also for those who can and for whom it may be easier, to endorse other financial initiatives against deep sea mining, such as the WWF-hosted business statement, which supports a moratorium on deep sea mining, or the Finance for Biodiversity statement of concern. I think for us as well, it's also important for financiers to screen their exposure to deep sea mining, which would then lead to divesting from wholly focused deep sea miners, or if it's not wholly focused, otherwise to engage with companies, basically supporting them to stop those organizations from working with those would-be deep sea miners. And then the last thing to say is for financiers and anyone else on the call who's interested to keep updated on the issues. My organization produces a quarterly email update, which I'm happy to send to those who are interested. And I think either feel free to contact me or sign up via the finance page on our website. And with that, I'll pass back, and again, happy to follow up with any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Whit. So we'll move directly now into the next set of presentations. I'm going to hand over first to Emin from Storebrand Asset Management. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Helen. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of this very important conversation. So for those of you who are not familiar with Storebrand, we are Norway's largest private asset manager, and we've been working on sustainable investments for more than 30 years. And our impact on society, on environment, is through investments in companies. We are invested in more than 5,000 companies around the globe. I want to pick up on some of Simon and Andy's points. So as Simon said, over the past years, there has been a growing recognition in the financial industry around biodiversity loss as a financial risk. In similar ways that we have been analyzing climate risk through the lens of physical and transition risk, investors are now trying to map, identify, understand, and manage high-risk sectors and high-risk companies, and manage these risks to protect long-term portfolio values. We expect these companies to be subject to, for example, stricter regulation if governments are upholding their obligations, for example, under the CBD. This is also the case for my own institution. Nature is a priority for us. We adopted a standalone nature policy right before the Kunming-Montreal Agreement back in 2022. And this policy applies to all assets under management. And in the policy, we have strengthened the application of the precautionary principle, meaning that if there are significant uncertainties, scientific uncertainties, we should wait until we have more scientific knowledge before investing. And for us, in our view, DSM, deep sea mining, falls under the precautionary principle. That is why we have a specific divestment criteria in the nature policy, and we screen our portfolios, all our investments, for pure players, the ones that are directly involved. And we have also signed a moratorium, which I believe Andy referred to, which is asking for a pause until we have fully understood both the environmental and the social risks. And the environmental aspect is, of course, important. It is not only important for civil society or for biologists, but for investors concerned about nature, because the economy and so many sectors depend on nature and ecosystem services. And this was very, very clearly outlined in the IPBES report, which was launched a couple of, I think it was earlier this year in February in Manchester. So besides the environmental aspects, which is so clearly linked to the economic aspect, there are also direct significant economic concerns around investments in deep sea mining, which investors are very concerned about, and it's becoming more evident for the investor community. Our view is that this is a high-risk industry due to regulatory risk and uncertainty. The industry lacks a stable legal framework, meaning that projects could face several legal challenges and operational delays. It is also an unproven technology. Current mining technology has only been tested at small scales with significant technological challenges reported in trials. But I think what I find the most interesting is when we have assessed the demand and the supply of these minerals, it is a contested necessity. You will have proponents argue deep sea mining are needed for a green transition, energy transition, for example, for EV batteries. But we have also seen a growing number of studies that are questioning the need for these minerals, arguing that alternative technologies and a circular economy can meet mineral demands. And this is a little bit the why. Why have we taken a very clear stance against deep sea mining? But I also wanted to give you a little bit insight into how we do this. And it goes back to Andy's recommendation. What are the things that an investor, a financial institution can do, and how can we do it? So within my sector, there is a long-standing debate whether we should divest or engage to influence corporate behavior. And if you divest from a company, then we reduce our ability to influence them and really challenge these companies. But it doesn't mean that you can't combine engagement and divestment. And in my own experience, I think it's most efficient when we both divest and engage at the same time. So our own strategy on deep sea mining is a combination of divestment and engagement, and we target the full value chain and relevant stakeholders, including policymakers. So first of all, we divest from pure players. We use the WWF Profundo database for that, and if you're a financial institution, it's a quite easy exercise. And then we engage with potential users and also exercise our shareholder rights at annual general assemblies, and we support resolutions. There were quite some resolutions back in 2025 and 2024 on deep sea mining. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, we engage with policymakers together with other financial institutions through Finance for Biodiversity. We have engaged with the International Seabed Authority. We send them a letter, urge them not to open up the deep sea for extraction, explained our rationale. We have also, Simon mentioned this is beyond national jurisdiction, but for us in Norway, this is a very controversial issue. We have also been in the parliament. My CEO has been in the parliament in the public hearings to raise concern to politicians here in Norway. And last year concluded, I would say, with a historic breakthrough. Norway has postponed commercial licensing until 2029. And we're, of course, monitoring the situation both in Norway, but also internationally. So this is a little bit about our work, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emin. And yes, interesting to hear you raise that report that came out quite recently about business. You're never going to have competitiveness in a bankrupted ocean. Okay, I will hand over now to Daniel Saylor from Metzler Asset Management, who is going to give an explanation of their stance.
So good afternoon. Yeah, my name is Daniel Seiler. I'm from Metzler Asset Management, based here in Frankfurt, Germany. So we have a long history in sustainable investments as well, and we actually took in August last year the significant step by becoming the first German asset manager who officially joined the international business statement supporting a moratorium on deep sea mining. So for us, this wasn't just a statement. This decision reflects our conviction that the risks, ecological, financial, and reputational, associated with deep sea mining are currently too high to be ignored. So I would like to take you with me on our journey, where we started and how we ended there. So there are three actually steps. Number one, the catalyst. Number two, the implication for our policy and stewardship. And number three, the momentum we are seeing in the German investment market. So number one, the catalyst. So actually in September 2024, the working group of Protestant churches here in Germany engaged with 7 German financial service providers in dialogues regarding sustainability and specifically focusing on deep sea mining. So for these investors, long-standing leaders in sustainable finance, they express their expectations that their partners, so banks and asset managers, should publicly support a moratorium. For the working group managing church funds, it is a matter of responsibility before humanity. So therefore, capital is invested both to meet future financial obligations and to uphold true ethical stewardship. To translate these concerns into a robust investment framework, we published a comprehensive research paper, only available in German language, on our website on deep sea mining. And our research featured also 2 interviews. First, with the managing director of the Protestant investor group to understand the ethical and the financial urgency from an institutional asset owner perspective. And second, with Andy, whom we have seen and heard earlier, he also provided in our research piece technical insights into the risks facing this industry. Number two, the policy integration and active stewardship. Based on the research, we have taken concrete action. We explicitly integrated the exclusion of companies involved in deep sea mining into our Metzler climate policy. So this policy had been implemented 2 or 3 years ago, addressing mainly how we handle companies with fossil fuel exposure. Obviously, the transition of these industries is quite important, and we want to be full transparent how we tackle fracking, coal-fired utilities, coal mining, but also the general oil and gas industry. And we see deep sea mining and the issues surrounding that as being an important part. So therefore, we have explicitly added certain exclusion criteria to our climate policy. But our approach extended beyond simple exclusions. So following our policy update, we proactively engaged the companies, the investor relation departments of every company in our investment universe with known or potential exposure to deep sea mining. So while responses levels varied, companies that did actually answer to us on my email, they emphasized that their technology is not critical and argued it would not result in adverse long-term environmental impacts. And clearly, this hasn't changed our view of the facts. But it's important, obviously, to signal to those companies that we have this policy in place and that we would not buy their equity or bonds within our investment products. One company actually argued, look, it's just like a big vacuum cleaner, and we can pick something from the seabed, and there's no disruption or anything like that. So that's how the companies see the topic. We all know that the science is different, and it's still important that we have these conversations like the webinar today. Number three, the momentum in the German marketplace. So what we are seeing now is a significant wave of momentum amongst faith-based investors. Following the leadership of Protestant groups, we are now observing that especially Catholic investors are also starting to evaluate and implement exclusions related to seabed mining. And in Germany, religious investors often lead the way on ethicals and ethics before other big institutions follow. When these groups representing billions in assets identify a sector as systemic risk, asset managers and other investors take notice. And finally, to conclude, I feel it's important to highlight that we support a moratorium not to block progress, but to ensure that industrial activity does not outpace our scientific understanding. By drawing these red lines today, we are protecting the long-term value of our portfolios and the stability of our planet. Thank you. I'm looking forward to any question.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I hope you can all hear me okay, because I think my Wi-Fi is being a bit temperamental. We have had a couple of questions through. So we'll move on to them now. One of the questions is, for investors who haven't yet taken a position, what would you say is the most prudent course today? Wait for regulatory clarity, engage with companies, or move to exclusion? And what risk are they taking by delaying that decision? So this, I'll hand over to Simon first. If you'd like to say something about this?
Yeah, I think that's a question for everybody. It's a good one. Perhaps if Daniel and Amin would respond to that first, is it more for the investors?
I mean, there was actually a big media article. I shared it with Andy. We can maybe also share it as a follow-up as well in the German news, where they looked actually at policies of banks who claimed to have a policy in place for deep sea mining. And then it turned out that certain banks did not include every business activity into that. So obviously, as a bank, you can buy bonds, you can issue bonds, you can do project finance. You have an asset management division, you have a private banking division. And so it can be a kind of actually greenwashing risk if you as a bank do something but don't do it properly. And that's one thing. You should be really clear on that. But on the other hand, it's a reputational risk if you claim that sustainability is in your DNA, or that's something which is important to you, which more and more banks and financial institutions do and did over the last years. And if you don't act on it, and if you are not fully transparent, this can be a reputational and greenwashing risk for any financial institution, from my point of view.
Excellent, thank you. Amin, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, no, I think Daniel answered that quite well, but I think it really depends on what kind of institution you are and your policies, right? I think it's such a huge risk in delaying this decision, because it's a litigation risk for us as investors and for companies. So if you're serious about managing risk, this is not only about environmental risk, but it's a financial risk for your portfolios and ultimately a systemic risk. Then I would really recommend a combination between exclusion and engagement. We need to really understand the full value chain, upstream and downstream, to make sure that the full value chain moves in the same direction. It will not be sufficient if only a few companies take a clear stance, right? We have the upstream and downstream that needs to be mobilized. You need to challenge the companies that are non-mining companies and ask them what kind of sourcing policies do they have? Have they considered to sign the moratorium? Do they understand the risks associated with deep sea mining? So these are questions that I would also ask for non-mining companies, let's say the auto sector, which can be potential buyers.
Excellent, thank you. It kind of ties in with another question we've had, which is, could deep sea mining become a hidden exposure in ESG labeled funds via supply chains rather than a direct investment decision? So I suppose that's also that risk. I don't know if anyone wants to add more on that.
I'll come in if it's okay. More on the first question. I don't know if I can add too much more to that, because I think in some ways it's almost a statement. But yeah, and it's been added to already. But I guess for me, I mean, I'm very glad that, I mean, both in the presentation and just now kind of clarified that work around both divestment and engagement. And I think that's really important. I mean, for me, I think I've talked to quite a few different financiers, and I think it really depends on the institution, what position you take. For me, I would personally advocate creating a policy around exclusion if possible, simply because it gives more clarity. It's for me, it's the stronger the more direct of all of the options. However, it's not necessarily for all companies, and it's not necessarily for all types of financiers. So I understand that. For some, it's easier to sign up to these different statements, joint statements, although for others, it can be problematic in terms of getting internal clearance around joint statements. So, so again, I think it differs, and what you can do, I think, do, and if you can do more than one of those, brilliant. But just to quickly finish up on that question of divestment versus engagement, I think for us, I mean, we work with WWF and Profundo on that list, keeping the list for due diligence updated. It was always clear to us that we wanted to differentiate between what we call pure plays, as in the very small number of very small companies who are just focused on starting the deep sea mining industry, and a sort of larger number of different types of companies who are supporting in some way or another. So for us, I think it's always clear that divestment in pure plays is probably the best option, because generally speaking, they don't have any other business. It's not like they're going to go to anything else. So, do engage with them, persuade them to do something else if possible, but divestment is likely to be the answer you're going to get to rather quickly. For those other, enablers of the industry, if you will, I think they really do have options to be doing other things. And so, engaging with them to get them to not support the industry, for me, is the key thing. So just think it's quite important to differentiate on that. Thanks.
Perhaps to expand a little bit on the question about which are the companies in that list and where to do the cutoff points as well, because this is a question that we've gotten as well. Obviously, the deep sea mining companies who already have exploration contracts or are eyeing exploration contracts, whether it be under US license or another type of license, of course, that's the main target. But then for these companies to actually start deep sea mining, there's a need for a lot of equipment, a lot of ships and port facilities and also the refineries and smelters and the entire value chain. So for banks who are concerned about deep sea mining, there is a need of a cutoff point where to which companies you really say no to and others that you might be invested in already and want to exert influence through having some kind of holding or some kind of engagement in those suppliers or suppliers to be or suppliers that are marketing themselves as future suppliers for this industry. So obviously you can work on many different strands as a financier who have supported or is keen to support a moratorium statement or even have adopted a policy.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Can I just add one on the question, could deep sea mining become a hidden exposure? Because I think this has been quite difficult for us to map, and the list from Andy and his colleagues has been extremely useful. But mapping your exposure is always a very difficult exercise when you're exposed to 5,000 listed companies. So I'll give you an example of that. We have been engaging with 2 Norwegian companies that are not linked directly to deep sea mining, but they had invested in an unlisted company that was directly involved with deep sea mining. So indirectly, we had an exposure. And the rationale for them for investing in this company, which is now bankrupt, going back to the economic case, was that they were interested in the research aspect of it. And then we challenged them and said, if you're interested in research, create linkages with universities and independent research institutions, not companies that are both want to explore and do the research at the same time. So it's been really difficult to map all this, especially being in Norway, and this is a very controversial issue here with companies interested. It's been really difficult to map the landscape. So you can have a hidden exposure, although you have clear policies, divestment criteria, screening your portfolios quarterly. So it's really not an easy exercise.
Yeah, it sounds like a minefield, if you excuse the pun, to try and make sure nothing's creeping through. Does anyone else want to add anything on that, or I move on to the next question?
I'll add just one thing quickly, if I may, just to say, I think that's the Deutsche Welle article that Daniel mentioned that kind of maps different institutions that have potential investments. I think some of those are because there are sort of joint investment vehicles, exchange trade funds that a lot of larger institutions end up investing in. And I think that is a route by which, if deep sea mining becomes big enough, grows, that people may be investing through those. And that is problematic because what tends to happen in these big exchange trade funds is that it's a pool of different companies, and deep sea mining companies could be part of those. And I think we do. If we deal with that, we deal with it by talking to the people who put those exchange trade funds together. But it's it is a problematic issue. So I think the answer is yes to that question. It is a potential hidden exposure, and there are ways that people, even if they don't want to invest it, could end up investing in it. But I think we just have to be aware of that and do what we can on a case-by-case basis.
Excellent. Thank you, Whit. We've 15 minutes left, so I'm going to move on to another question. This question is, there is growing evidence that national interest in securing domestic control of critical mineral supply chains is becoming a primary driver, with pricing potentially becoming a secondary consideration. How should our perspective shift if national security considerations are paramount and deep sea mining could serve as a mitigating solution? Is there anyone who would like to start the answer round with this one?
Yeah, perhaps I can have a first stab and Wheat, you can continue. And of course, this is the paramount question as I started with the geopolitics. Obviously, the US is very keen, and the Trump administration is very keen to go ahead because of the competition against China specifically. The problem, though, is that there is no credible way of really demonstrating that deep sea mining would have the value chain to actually come with the critical raw materials in due time to actually do that competition. There is no credible way of, I mean, we talked about the technology here, but we can also talk about the processing and how to make these nodules, these potato-shaped polymetallic nodules from the Clarion-Clipperton zone actually becoming something that we can use in our electric vehicles or in power grids or whatever. The technology isn't there for that, and you can't. It's not a plug and play thing. You need to have, so much different metallurgy processing. It's not the same as terrestrial ore, and people don't understand this, and I'm quite worried about that. I think financing needs finance needs to understand this as well. That deep sea mining is not a solution for the security issues, and if deep sea mining would start, then I think the player that is really earning a lot on that would be the player who dominates the value chains of nickel, cobalt, and manganese, copper as well. So a small number of actors creates new choke points rather than removing them. So financiers who really are concerned about security would do better in actually focusing on the circular economy aspect to really mitigate that issue through really creating resilience, reducing the demand, and also focusing more on substitution on other types of battery chemistries. I mean, the electric vehicle market is the largest driver of demand, and of course, it's really important to focus the funding where the real choke points are. And I think that's where I would start my studying on that question. First, you want to continue there with? I see that you're unmuted.
Yeah, sure. I'll add. I mean, there isn't much more I can add because you've done a great job there of making a case. But I guess for me, one thing just to stress to add on is, it's interesting to me. I mean, when she was presenting, you pointed out that so much of the narrative has been around the energy transition, and it's amazing how rapidly that narrative has shifted. In fact, probably so rapidly that I read journalists' articles and actually they sort of state it as if that's the main case, whereas now so many of the companies are making arguments around security or tied in with critical mineral issues. So, aside from the fact that really a lot of the minerals, certainly from polymetallic nodules, aren't necessarily the ones that are key in terms of critical minerals, which are rare earths, which in general, although there are rare earths in polymetallic nodules, I've not seen anyone seriously talking about them being able to financially viably do it. For me, the real issue is we've spent a long time making good arguments as to why the industry isn't financially viable. It is a worry now that, with this new narrative, it may be that governments will finance it, will fund it anyway. But I guess for me, the key point there is if you are a citizen who's concerned about this, that government funding is effectively your taxpayers' money. So, whereas there are campaign groups, that are focused like ourselves around private financiers, I think as this narrative shifts, it will be interesting to see how many groups who work with the likes of the World Bank and sort of other ways government funding will be, adopting deep sea mining and the concerns around it so that they can mobilize citizens so that, this industry isn't started effectively in their name and with their money.
Emin or Daniel, did you want to add anything on this point?
Can I just share one comment from Norway? I'm sorry, giving many examples here from Norway, but in the public hearing that we had, going back to Andy's point, I reviewed all the public hearings from the private sector. We were the only financial institution that were concerned about this. In all the other submissions that we saw, there was one common message. They made it clear that they need economic incentives to make it financially viable, meaning that the government needs to subsidize a harmful industry, which is not in line with the Global Biodiversity Framework Target 18, which says that all governments need to map and phase out their harmful subsidies. So this is a very clear message from the industry themselves. They need economic incentives to move ahead.
I mean, I would also add on this kind of argument for defragmentation, national security, that this is something we have seen now over the last couple of years, that this is a general fact for every company, for every industry, that you need to do a due diligence on your supply chain for all kinds of materials you source. It's not only the critical minerals. We now see how dependent we are on certain gases for the chip manufacturing. Since the Iran war 1 or 2 years ago, nobody was aware of that. You just had the gas if you have children for those balloons. So now everybody understands that it's not just for the balloons, it's also for chip manufacturing. This is valid for oil and gas. This is valid for so many things. So I think that it's a false argument to say you need it for your national security. You need so many things, and it's more like, this is more an argument that states need to go back to work together, like we try in Europe to find new partners with Canada or with India. So I think maybe the good thing of all the terrible things happening out there is that we try to now form new alliances to secure commodities, minerals, to find new partnerships, because the world can do this only in peace and working together, because those minerals are so separated globally that no state by themselves can secure everything they need. I think that's not really possible.
Thank you, everyone. We've got a few minutes left, so I'll just touch on the final question we have, which we've already hinted at slightly, which is if the report makes a strong case, that financial support for deep sea mining is shrinking, but where do you think funding actually comes from if the industry moves ahead anyway? We already heard about, governments then stepping in if we see it's in national interest. Are there other sources where the industry could potentially find funding support, or are there enough doors closed to prevent it if we can talk governments into not backing this industry?
So I think if you look at the stock quote and the market cap of the metals company, I just looked it up. It says it has 1.4 billion euros market cap. So there are still many investors out there evaluating this company with 1.4 billion. I mean, the share price has been at $10. Now it's at $4, so it has shrunk a lot, but still there's so many investors who don't care, and especially out of the Europe area. So they just look into this kind of investment story. And if you go on the webpage and the marketing they do and others, it sounds like, yeah, you need to be invested. So you see the gold price sharing, they tell you we find gold in the sea, and investors don't care about ethics or environmental effects. So I think we are still far away from that these companies have any restrictions or challenges to find investors. I think there needs to be much more happening especially on a global basis, that this actually goes in that direction.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think that is an important point. And yeah, if I could follow on, I would say that, I think there will always be places where an industry like deep sea mining can get finance from if necessary. And indeed, we really need to differentiate, I think, between this early stage where they don't need a huge amount of money for what they're doing, and when they if they get to the point of actually starting to mine, when they will become more capital intensive, when they need to build more ships, build more machinery, etc. And I think that's when it becomes more problematic. I think at the moment, many of the financial institutions that are in our reports are larger financial institutions that they don't necessarily need to be troubled with at the moment, but they almost certainly will at a later point. But I think for me, it's not that they won't find alternatives. It's that the fewer options they have, the more expensive raising that money becomes. And I think, that's at the end of the day, even leaving aside any government subsidy, the industry has to have some sort of financial return. And the more expensive it becomes to borrow money, the more expensive it definitely becomes to insure. And I think insurance is potentially a really key issue because, again, we've already said from the report that one of the key issues is the unknown risks. And for insurers, that's a real problem. So, I think that's the point. It's not so much that they won't find any money, but it's the fact that it will become, that much more expensive, and it basically affects the bottom line.
Perhaps just to add a little tiny point to that as well is that, I mean, obviously, reputational risk was not one of the main risks that we found in our mapping. However, as a secondary or a third reason, we saw that quite a few times. And also, if you go and Google different executives on different journals and media outlets, that's usually also one of the things that pop up quite a lot, the regulatory part. And here we can talk about the mining code in the ISA and the negotiations there being not at all finished. And there are quite few points about, for instance, liabilities and enforcement, and also the potential restoration costs. What happens if the marine environment is really severely damaged? Then there needs to be restoration, and there's been some estimations on how much that can cost in those remote areas. Of course, this is not something that the metals company would like to talk about, and others alike. And then if you look at the US, regulation, as they updated the consolidated version of applications in international waters earlier this year, if you look at, for instance, the little article hidden very well that even by an executive order, the president can terminate the contract. I mean, if investors would really read those fine letters and see that, okay, wow, if there's a democratic, if there's another one at the helm in the White House, with the potential of revoking a US license for an investor, perhaps that's not the best thing to know, right? So you put a lot of money into the metals company, and all of a sudden they can't do it. So I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and of course it's very important that we play our roles in informing these. This is the facts. This is what's out there, and decision makers need to know this. Decision makers also including bank executives, of course.
Thank you, Simon. We've one last question, which might take us 1 minute over time, but if people can suggest something very quickly with one question, can you suggest pathways to reach financial institutions in the United States? If anyone has a very quick response to this very tricky question, please take the floor.
I would maybe do it through a series. They're engaging with financial institutions in the US.
I think we already found a few. We found 5, was it 4 or 5 amongst the 82 that come from the US or had headquarters in the US. So, we can start there somewhere, right?
Indeed. And there is another US organization called As You Sow that does shareholder action around that's been working. So again, I think all of those, but again, I'm happy to answer that offline. So, okay, lovely, thanks.
Yeah, we have a couple more questions that we don't have time to get to, but we will take note of them and we will try to send you a response via email, as Whit just said. So bang on the dot now it's 17:01, but nearly bang on the dot. I'm going to close the webinar. Thank you so much, Emmy, Daniel, Whit, Simon, for your presentations. It was hugely interesting. So much food for thought, so much work ahead, but great that we've got the conversation going, and it will be continued. Please check on the website in the coming days. We'll have the webinar on there in case you want to rewatch, or if it's, you know, inspiring follow-up questions that you want to contact us with. All of our contact details are on our website. And I'm sure we'll see you all again very soon at a future webinar. Thank you, everyone.